The mining explosion happened on a Thursday afternoon when the twin suns hung low over the crimson cliffs of Draken Prime. Thomas Hawke had been inspecting the eastern shaft when the ground beneath him started to tremble. He was a simple equipment technician, nothing special about him except for the strange burn scar that wrapped around his left forearm like frozen flames. The warning sirens came too late. A pocket of volatile gas had ignited deep within the crystalline caverns where both humans and the dragon-like Valkyrie worked side by side. Thomas ran toward the sound of the explosion rather than away from it. His boots pounded against the metal walkways as smoke billowed from the tunnel entrance. Inside the collapsed shaft, chaos ruled. Emergency lights flickered through clouds of dust and debris. Thomas could hear voices crying out in multiple languages, some human, some in the deep rumbling tones of the Valkyrie. He grabbed a fallen support beam and began pulling rubble away from a blocked passage. That was when he saw him. A massive Valkyrie miner trapped beneath a collapsed scaffolding, his crimson scales dulled by dust and blood. The alien's golden eyes met his, and Thomas saw something he recognized all too well. Resignation. The acceptance of death. Thomas refused to accept it. He braced himself against a stable rock formation and gripped the twisted metal framework. His muscles screamed in protest as he pulled with everything he had. The scar on his arm burned hot, as it always did when he pushed himself beyond normal limits. Inch by painful inch, the scaffolding shifted. The Valkyrie miner, whose name Thomas would later learn was Corvin, stared at him with undisguised shock. Most humans avoided the Valkyrie, intimidated by their size and their ability to breathe smoke and small gouts of flame. But Thomas had seen far worse than different-looking aliens. He had seen humans at their worst, and that was infinitely more terrifying. With a final heave that made his vision blur with pain, Thomas freed the trapped miner. Corvin scrambled to his feet with surprising agility for someone his size. Together they stumbled through the smoke-filled tunnels, supporting each other as the mine continued to collapse around them. They emerged into the harsh sunlight just as another section of the mine caved in behind them. Medical teams rushed forward, but Thomas waved them off, heading toward the quieter section of the compound. His hands were bleeding, his shoulder dislocated, but all he wanted was to be alone with the weight of what he had just done. He found an empty storage area behind the medical facility and sat down hard against the wall. His fingers fumbled with his sleeve, rolling it up to reveal the scar. It always looked the same no matter how many times he checked. Twisting patterns that resembled flames caught in the moment of explosion. 7 years had passed since the freighter incident that had given him this mark. 7 years since fire and decompression had taken his entire crew while he survived. Sometimes he wondered if survival was really a blessing or just a different kind of curse. A small sound made him look up. A child stood at the corner of the building, watching him with enormous amber eyes. She was Valkyrie, barely waist-high, with scales that shimmered like polished gold in the afternoon light. Her small wings, still too underdeveloped for flight, twitched nervously against her back. Thomas tried to smile at her, but she darted away like a frightened bird. He did not blame her. Most Valkyrie children were taught to be cautious around humans, just as human children were taught to be wary of Valkyrie. Fear bred more fear in an endless cycle. He leaned his head back and closed his eyes, letting exhaustion wash over him. Tomorrow there would be reports to file and questions to answer. The colonial administrators would want to know why he had risked his life for an alien when proper evacuation protocols existed. They would lecture him about safety regulations and liability concerns. But tomorrow was not today. For now, he just sat in the shade and let himself feel the ache in his bones and the familiar burn of old memories. The scar on his arm had stopped its painful throbbing, settling back into its usual state of being just a reminder of the past he could never outrun. Thomas did not consider himself a hero. Heroes saved people because they were brave and noble. He saved people because he had failed to save the ones who mattered most, and some broken part of him kept hoping that maybe, just maybe, if he saved enough strangers, the scales would eventually balance. That the faces of his dead crew would stop haunting his dreams. The mathematics never worked out that way, but he kept trying anyway. Because what else could he do? The scar on his arm was not just a mark from the fire. It was a brand that reminded him every single day that he had survived when others had not. That he had crawled through burning corridors and explosive decompression while his friends and colleagues died around him. That he had been lucky when luck seemed like the cruelest joke the universe could play. 3 days later, Thomas was back at work despite the medical team's protests. His shoulder was healing but still painful. Bandages wrapped around both hands made gripping tools awkward. But staying idle in his quarters just gave him too much time to think, and thinking led nowhere good. He lived in a basic residential unit in the human sector of the colony. 1 room with a bed, a small food preparation area, and a bathroom that recycled everything with remarkable efficiency. The walls were bare except for a single photograph of his old crew, back when they had all been alive and full of plans for the future. The colony of Draken Prime existed because of the rich mineral deposits buried beneath its surface. Humans had established mining operations in the cooler regions while the Valkyrie claimed the volcanic territories where their heat-resistant bodies thrived. It was an arrangement born of necessity rather than friendship, but it worked well enough most days. Thomas spent his mornings checking equipment calibrations and his afternoons performing maintenance on the drilling rigs. It was simple work that kept his hands busy and his mind relatively quiet. He avoided the other human workers who wanted to talk about the rescue, deflecting their questions with shrugs and changes of subject. But he could not avoid the feeling of being watched. The feeling of being watched persisted throughout the following week. Thomas caught glimpses of golden scales darting behind equipment crates and supply containers. The small Valkyrie child from before seemed to have developed a fascination with him, though she maintained a careful distance at all times that he tried to ignore it at first. Children were curious creatures, regardless of species. Perhaps she had never seen a human up close before, or maybe she was just bored and found his routine interesting. But something about the intensity of her gaze made him uneasy in a way he could not quite explain. On the 8th day after the mine collapse, Thomas was repairing a coolant pump near the boundary between the human and Valkyrie territories when he heard small footsteps approaching. He did not turn around, giving the child the option to retreat if she wanted to. Instead, the footsteps grew closer until a tiny shadow fell across his work area. Thomas glanced over his shoulder. The golden-scaled child stood barely 3 feet away, her amber eyes fixed on him with an expression that seemed far too serious for someone so young. She wore a simple tunic in the Valkyrie style, and her small wings were folded neatly against her back. "Hello," Thomas said in Galactic Common, the trade language most species used for basic communication. His voice came out rougher than he intended. The child did not respond. She just continued to stare at him with those enormous eyes. Thomas returned to his work, tightening bolts and checking pressure readings. If she wanted to watch, that was her choice. He had learned long ago that sometimes silence was better than forced conversation. Several minutes passed. The child remained motionless, watching his every movement. Thomas finished with the coolant pump and gathered his tools, preparing to move to the next maintenance point. As he stood and turned, the child suddenly darted forward. Before Thomas could react, small clawed fingers grabbed his left forearm. The child pushed up his sleeve with surprising strength, exposing the burned scar that wrapped around his skin. Her eyes widened, and she made a sound that was half gasp, half chirp. "Daddy has this," she exclaimed in heavily accented Galactic Common. Her voice was high and excited, almost reverent. "Same mark. Daddy has same mark." Thomas gently pulled his arm back, his heart pounding with confusion. "I think you have me confused with someone else, little one. I am not your father." But the child shook her head vigorously, her golden scales catching the light. "No, no. Not you, Daddy. But you have Daddy mark. Fire mark." She pointed at his scar with one small claw. "Daddy has fire mark too. On arm, same place. Same pattern." A cold feeling settled in Thomas's stomach. The scar was unique to him, a result of the specific pattern of burns he had suffered during the freighter explosion. The chances of someone else having an identical mark were astronomically small. Unless something else was at play. "Where is your father now?" Thomas asked, keeping his voice calm despite the questions racing through his mind. The child's excitement dimmed slightly. "Daddy working in deep mines. Hot place where humans cannot go. But he has fire mark, just like you. I see it many times. He touches it when he thinks I am sleeping. When he looks sad." Thomas crouched down to the child's eye level. "What is your name?" "Sarah," she replied. "Sarah, daughter of Corvin." The name hit Thomas like a physical blow. Corvin. The Valkyrie miner he had pulled from the collapsed tunnel. The one whose life he had saved without asking questions or expecting gratitude. And this child was claiming her father bore the same scar that marked Thomas as a survivor of tragedy. "Can you take me to your father?" Thomas asked. "I would like to speak with him." Sarah nodded enthusiastically and grabbed his hand with her small claws. She began pulling him toward the Valkyrie sector of the colony, chattering constantly in a mixture of galactic common and her native tongue. Thomas followed, his mind spinning with possibilities and impossibilities. The Valkyrie territory was noticeably hotter than the human areas. Thomas felt sweat beginning to soak through his work shirt as they walked deeper into the zone where volcanic vents provided the warmth the dragon-like species preferred. The architecture here was different too, built from heat-resistant materials and designed to accommodate wings and tails. Sarah led him to a residential structure that looked similar to his own quarters but built on a larger scale. She pushed open the door without hesitation and called out in her native language. A moment later, Corvin appeared from an inner room. The large Valkyrie froze when he saw Thomas standing in his doorway. His golden eyes, so similar to his daughter's, widened with recognition and something else. Something that looked like shock mixed with an emotion Thomas could not quite identify. "You," Corvin said in his deep, rumbling voice. His galactic common was better than his daughter's. "The human who pulled me from the collapse. I have been searching for you to offer proper thanks." "Daddy!" Sarah interrupted, bouncing with excitement. "Show him. Show him your fire mark. It is the same, I told you it is the same." Corvin looked confused for a moment, then understanding dawned in his eyes. He glanced at his daughter, then at Thomas's partially exposed forearm where the sleeve had not quite fallen back into place. Slowly, deliberately, Corvin reached up and pulled back the scales along his own left forearm. Thomas felt the ground shift beneath his feet. There, on Corvin's arm in the exact same location as his own scar, was an identical pattern. Burns that twisted and overlapped like frozen flames. The same mark that Thomas had carried for 7 years, believing it to be unique to him and his tragedy. "How?" Thomas whispered, his voice barely audible. Corvin's expression was grave. "Perhaps we should sit down. This conversation is long overdue, and the truth is more complicated than you might imagine." Part 3, The Truth in Flames. Thomas sat on a bench designed for Valkyrie proportions, feeling small and off balance in more ways than one. Sarah had been sent to play in another room despite her protests, leaving the two adults alone with the weight of impossible coincidence hanging between them. Corvin paced slowly, his tail swishing with agitation. The larger alien seemed to be struggling with where to begin. Finally, he stopped and faced Thomas directly. 7 years ago, Corvin began, his voice heavy with old pain, "I was not a miner on Draken Prime. I was a cargo specialist aboard a mixed-species freighter called the Stellar Harmony. We transported goods across the outer colonies, nothing particularly dangerous or exciting. Just honest work." Thomas felt his blood turn to ice. The Stellar Harmony. That was the name of his ship. The freighter that had exploded and killed nearly everyone aboard. "You were there," Thomas said, his voice flat. It was not a question. Corvin nodded slowly. "I was in the lower cargo bay when the coolant system failed. The fire spread so quickly that by the time the alarm sounded, half the ship was already consumed. I tried to reach the emergency pods, but the corridors were blocked. I thought I was going to die. Thomas sat on a bench designed for Valkyrie proportions, feeling small and off balance in more ways than one. Sarah had been sent to play in another room despite her protests, leaving the two adults alone with the weight of impossible coincidence hanging between them. Corvin paced slowly, his tail swishing with agitation. The larger alien seemed to be struggling with where to begin. Finally, he stopped and faced Thomas directly. 7 years ago, Corvin began, his voice heavy with old pain, I was not a miner on Draken Prime. I was a cargo specialist aboard a mixed-species freighter called the Stellar Harmony. We transported goods across the outer colonies, nothing particularly dangerous or exciting. Just honest work. Thomas felt his blood turn to ice. The Stellar Harmony. That was the name of his ship. The freighter that had exploded and killed nearly everyone aboard. You were there, Thomas said, his voice flat. It was not a question. Corvin nodded slowly. I was in the lower cargo bay when the coolant system failed. The fire spread so quickly that by the time the alarm sounded, half the ship was already consumed. I tried to reach the emergency pods, but the corridors were blocked. I thought I was going to die. The Valkyrie sat down heavily on the bench beside Thomas, his massive frame making the furniture creak. Then I saw you. A human technician running through flames that should have killed you instantly. You were pulling people toward the emergency airlocks, one after another. You saved 4 crew members before the explosion that trapped you. Thomas remembered that night in fragments. The heat, the screaming, the desperate scramble to get people to safety before the ship tore itself apart. He remembered pulling bodies through smoke and flame, his clothes catching fire, his skin blistering. He remembered the final explosion that had blown him into an emergency pod just before the main hull decompressed. I did not save enough, Thomas said quietly. 18 people died. 18 people I could not reach in time. But 6 lived because of you, Corvin countered. 6 souls who would have perished if you had fled to safety when you had the chance. I was one of those 6. You dragged me through a corridor filled with fire, and in doing so, you pressed your burning arm against mine to shield me from a jet of flame. Corvin pulled back his sleeve fully, revealing the entire extent of the burn pattern. It matched Thomas's scar perfectly because they had been created at the same moment, pressed together in the heat and chaos of a dying ship. The medical teams on the rescue vessel could not fully heal burns of this severity, Corvin continued. They said the damage went too deep, that the pattern would remain forever. I have carried this mark as a reminder of the human who saved my life when he could have saved himself instead. Thomas looked down at his own scar, seeing it with new eyes. He had always viewed it as a mark of failure, a reminder of everyone he had not saved. But to Corvin, an identical mark represented survival and sacrifice. I never knew anyone else carried this scar, Thomas admitted. After the rescue, they separated us for medical treatment. Different species need different care protocols. By the time I recovered enough to ask questions, everyone had been dispersed to their home worlds or new assignments. I never learned who survived beyond the basic count. I searched for you, Corvin said. I spent months trying to track down the human technician who had pulled me from the fire. But you had disappeared. Changed your name, moved to remote colonies, stayed off the registration networks. I thought perhaps you had died after all, and the records were simply incomplete. Thomas nodded slowly. I ran. I could not face the families of the people who died. Could not handle the questions and the sympathy and the way people looked at me like I was some kind of hero when I felt like a failure. So I changed my identity and found work in places where nobody asked too many questions. They sat in silence for a long moment, 2 survivors of the same tragedy finally brought together by chance and a curious child's observation. The weight of 7 years pressed down on both of them. Sarah is 4 years old, Corvin said eventually, his voice softening. She was born 2 years after the stellar harmony incident. Her mother died during the birthing process. It is not uncommon among our people, but it left me alone to raise her. I took work as a miner because it paid well and did not require much travel. I wanted to be present for my daughter. She seems bright, Thomas offered, unsure what else to say. She is observant beyond her years, Corvin agreed with a note of pride. When she saw your scar, she recognized it immediately. She has seen me touch this mark countless times, usually when I am thinking about that night. About the fire and the fear and the human who chose to save others rather than himself. Thomas felt something crack inside his chest. For 7 years he had carried guilt like a stone in his heart. He had replayed that night endlessly, cataloging every decision and every second of delay. He had convinced himself that if he had been faster or smarter or braver, everyone would have survived. But here sat living proof that his actions had mattered. That despite the losses, despite the failures, he had pulled someone through the flames who went on to have a daughter. To build a life. To find meaning in survival. I need to tell you something, Thomas said, his voice rough with emotion he had kept locked away for too long. After that night, I have been trying to balance the scales. Every person I save is supposed to make up for the ones I lost. But it never works. The guilt never goes away. Corvin turned to look at him, those golden eyes filled with understanding. Survivor's guilt. Our people have a name for it too. The weight of borrowed time. We believe that those who survive tragedy carry a piece of those who did not. Not as a burden, but as a responsibility to live fully for those who cannot. I have not been living, Thomas admitted. I have been existing. Moving from colony to colony, doing simple work, staying isolated. Afraid to connect with anyone because connection means risk and risk means potential loss. Then perhaps, Corvin said gently, it is time to stop running. You saved my life, Thomas Hawke. That is your real name, yes? I found it in the old crew manifests. You saved my life, and in doing so, you gave Sarah the chance to exist. You gave me the opportunity to be a father. Those are not small things. Thomas looked at the scar on his arm and, for the first time in 7 years, tried to see it as something other than a mark of failure. Perhaps it was also a mark of survival. Of choice. Of the moment when he had decided that other lives mattered more than his own safety. The door to the other room opened, and Sarah peeked out cautiously. Are you done with grown-up talking? She asked hopefully. Corvin chuckled, a sound like distant thunder. Yes, little flame. We are done. Sarah bounded over to Thomas and grabbed his scarred arm again, her small claws gentle this time. You saved my daddy, so you are family now. That is how it works. Valkyrie law says anyone who saves a life becomes part of the saved one's clan. Thomas looked at Corvin questioningly. The large Valkyrie shrugged, his expression amused. She is not wrong. It is an old tradition, though not often invoked in modern times. But if you wish it, you would be welcome in my home as clan. For the first time since the stellar harmony exploded, Thomas felt something other than guilt and grief. A small spark of warmth, fragile and new. The possibility of connection. Of belonging to something again. I would like that, Thomas said quietly. Sarah chirped with delight and hugged his arm. Now I have Daddy and also clan uncle. We should celebrate. Daddy makes excellent roasted crystal fruits. As Corvin moved to prepare food and Sarah chattered about all the things she wanted to show her new clan uncle, Thomas sat in the warm Valkyrie dwelling and felt the burden on his shoulders shift slightly. Not gone, but perhaps distributed differently. Shared with someone who understood because he carried the same mark and the same memories. The scar on his arm would never disappear. But maybe it did not have to represent only loss. Maybe it could also represent connection, survival, and the unexpected family found in the aftermath of tragedy. Outside, the twin suns of Draken Prime began to set, painting the sky in shades of crimson and gold. And for the first time in 7 years, Thomas Hawk allowed himself to hope that tomorrow might be better than yesterday.